You are listening to the Tales of Conundrum podcast, Episode 7, Drones. Part 1, Shadows in the System. Steve Mallik had always loved the quiet thrill of a digital hunt. Tonight, the only sound in his cramped apartment was the faint hum of his desktop and the rhythmic creak of his chair as he leaned closer to the screen. His workspace, a chaotic mess of cables, monitors, and empty coffee mugs, mirrored the frenetic energy of his scam-baiting pursuits. This wasn't just a hobby, it was a mission. The scammer's fake tech support interface blinked on his primary monitor. Bright red warnings screamed about non-existent viruses, flashing a fabricated urgency that preyed on the unwary. Steve's lips quirked into a smirk. He loved this part, drawing them in, playing the hapless victim, and unraveling their operation one keystroke at a time. "Sir, the virus has compromised your entire network," the voice on the phone droned, thick with feigned concern. Steve's fingers danced across his keyboard. His voice, however, took on the same exaggerated panic the scammer projected. "Oh no, my bank account? I can't lose that. Hang on, let me find my details," he said, his tone a theatrical blend of desperation and naivety. It was a performance polished over years of catching con artists off guard. But tonight, Steve wasn't streaming. No live audience cheered him on. No real-time donations flooded in. This time, he wanted the full breadth of his focus on the task at hand. His eyes flitted from one monitor to the next, screens mirrored with layers of scammer files he'd infiltrated. He moved through their folders like a digital phantom, unseen, unheard. The usual garbage filled the directories, lists of victims, scripts for their calls, and spreadsheets tallying their ill-gotten gains. But then, something snagged his attention. A folder tucked in the corner of their network structure, its title standing out from the mundane clutter. Drone Op. "What's this?" he murmured under his breath, the faintest note of curiosity shading his words. His movement slowed. He sat straighter, fingers hovering above the mouse. This didn't belong here. Scam networks weren't sophisticated operations. They were sloppy, thrown together like digital stick-and-glue crafts. But this felt deliberate. Clicking into the folder, Steve expected nothing more than mislabeled junk files. His screen, however, erupted with blueprints, schematics of sleek, unmarked drones. A cascade of technical documents followed, detailing manufacturing processes, flight paths, and strategic deployment zones. Words jumped out at him in rapid flashes: payload capacity, target coordinates, Operation Thundercloud. His pulse quickened. He felt the weight of each discovery settling in his chest. This wasn't a scam. This was something bigger, something darker. His cursor hovered over a series of encrypted files, their titles marked with ominous phrases like launch timeline and control override protocol. He opened one, its contents a dense web of technical jargon and chilling specificity. "Sir? Are you there?" The scammer's voice crackled back to life on the phone, sharp and jarring. The tone had shifted from saccharine concern to irritated impatience. Steve jolted, instinctively closing the folder and minimizing the window. His free hand reached for the phone, disconnecting the call with a curt press of the end button. For a moment, the room felt too quiet, the hum of his equipment almost accusatory. He leaned back, dragging a hand across his face. The blue glow of his monitors cast shadows across the lines of tension etched into his features. For all his hours spent unraveling scams, nothing had prepared him for this. His mind reeled, connecting fragments of the information he'd just uncovered. If this was real, if the files were legitimate, then someone, some organization, was using these scam networks as a front for something incomprehensibly dangerous. "What the hell is this?" he whispered to no one but himself, his voice carrying the weight of disbelief tinged with unease. His gaze darted to the folder still minimized on his desktop. The room seemed smaller now, the air heavier. He couldn't shake the sensation that opening that folder had triggered something far beyond his control, an unseen chain of events already beginning to tighten around him. Slowly, deliberately, Steve reopened the folder. He had to be sure. Each file he clicked opened a new layer of dread. Schematics of drones capable of carrying payloads that weren't just for surveillance, documents outlining communications between shadowy entities, and cryptic messages littered with military jargon. His hands moved mechanically, saving copies onto an encrypted external drive. His instincts screamed at him to document everything, to secure evidence before it disappeared. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual nocturnal symphony, the faint rumble of distant traffic, the occasional wail of a siren. Yet within the walls of Steve's apartment, the world felt poised on a precipice. He sat frozen for a moment, fingers gripping the edge of his desk as though steadying himself against the enormity of what he'd just found. The adrenaline coursing through him sharpened every detail. The faint flicker of his monitors, the taste of stale coffee lingering on his tongue, the faint thrum of his heartbeat pounding in his ears. His phone vibrated on the desk, the caller ID displaying an unlisted number. Steve stared at it, an unfamiliar knot tightening in his stomach. He didn't answer. His attention snapped back to the screen, to the files that painted a picture of an operation so meticulously planned it felt surreal. He knew he needed to act, but the weight of the discovery pressed down on him, locking him in place. Steve's voice broke the silence, soft but resolute. "Trap Squad," he muttered, using the name of his loyal online community. "You're not going to believe this." Steve saved the last file, his hands steady despite the storm brewing in his mind. The folder disappeared from the scammer's network, as though it had never existed. He stared at his screen, the cursor blinking back at him like a taunt. Somewhere, far beyond the walls of his tiny apartment, wheels were turning, plans were in motion, and Steve Mallik had just stepped into the middle of it all. Part 2. The Man Behind the Trap. The folder icon sat on his desktop like an unblinking eye, daring him to look away. Steve Mallik didn't. He leaned back, the old chair beneath him letting out a low groan, its weary springs echoing the weight of what he'd uncovered. His small apartment felt oppressively quiet now, save for the persistent hum of his monitors. Somewhere outside, the muted sound of a passing car broke the stillness, but it might as well have been a world away. Steve reached for his coffee mug, cold, half-empty, and forgotten, but didn't take a sip. His gaze lingered on the folder. He had spent years peeling back the digital facades of scammers, exposing their schemes to his ever-growing audience on Bait the Trap, his YouTube channel. But this was a different beast altogether. The channel had started as therapy, a way to channel his anger after a scam had stripped him of everything. At first, it was clumsy. He recorded shaky videos in his dimly lit apartment, recounting his story with the raw frustration of someone trying to claw back what he'd lost. Over time, his technical skills sharpened, and so did his audience's appetite for his victories. The Trap Squad formed, an eclectic community of coders, tech geeks, and everyday people who shared his passion for exposing fraud. Together, they had celebrated real wins. A call center in India shut down, arrests made in connection to phishing rings. Those were the good days. But tonight's discovery felt different. Bigger. Darker. The kind of discovery that made his skin crawl. He reached out and clicked the folder again, opening it. The files inside glowed like embers in the dim light of his monitors. Blueprints of drones stared back at him. Sleek, mechanical predators detailed with precision that spoke of military-grade engineering. Beneath the schematics were logs, flight paths, operational zones, coordinates that intersected with major U.S. cities. Then, there were the documents, pages dense with technical jargon, peppered with chilling phrases like payload deployment and civilian disruption. But it was one title that refused to let his eyes move past it. Launch Phase Timeline. He opened it, and the air in the room seemed to constrict. The document wasn't just a theoretical plan. It was detailed, methodical, with dates and times that lined up ominously with key infrastructure schedules. Steve's hand hovered over the mouse, the gravity of what he was reading sinking in deeper with every line. "This is way out of my league," he murmured, his voice barely breaking the stillness of the room. Yet it carried an edge, not fear exactly, but the weight of realization. He needed help. Turning to his secondary monitor, he opened the live recording software. The red light blinked to life, a beacon of connection to the thousands of people who followed his work. The familiar rush of adrenaline flickered to life, but tonight it wasn't tinged with his usual triumphant energy. Instead, it was laced with unease. "Trap Squad," he began, his voice steady but underpinned with a tension that made each word deliberate. "I've stumbled on something insane. This isn't your usual call center script or phishing scam. We're talking drones, lots of them, and not the kind you buy for fun at Best Buy." He paused, letting the words sink in, imagining the flood of comments that would soon light up his screen. The thought gave him a fleeting moment of comfort. The squad always showed up. He glanced at his chat window, still empty, the delay in the stream keeping their reactions just out of reach. Steve clicked back to the folder, sharing his screen with the stream. As the chat caught up, the feed exploded with speculation, strings of text pouring in faster than he could read. Questions, expletives, disbelief, all blending into a frenetic wall of engagement. "Hold on," Steve said, holding up a hand as if they could see him. His tone sharpened, commanding attention but threaded with urgency. "Let me walk you through this." He highlighted the schematics first, tracing the outlines of the drones with his cursor. "These aren't toys. Look at the engineering. This is military-grade hardware. Or close enough. Here's the kicker." He opened the flight path logs. "These coordinates, they're U.S. cities, major hubs. Look at this cluster here." He zoomed in, the map revealing intersections that painted a chilling picture. The chat erupted again, this time with theories, government projects gone rogue, international espionage, even alien conspiracies. Steve ignored the noise, focusing on the files in front of him. The more he uncovered, the more he felt the ground shifting beneath him. His voice dropped, lower now, measured. "This isn't just a plan. It's operational. There's a timeline. And it's soon." He leaned back, his hand running through his hair in a gesture of frustrated disbelief. The chair groaned again, a sharp contrast to the silence that had swallowed the room. The adrenaline that had carried him through countless scam-busting sessions now felt like a weight pressing against his ribs. "What do we do?" The question wasn't directed at his audience, though the chat immediately lit up with responses. It was for him, for the voice in the back of his mind that always seemed to guide him when things got messy. Only this time, the voice was silent. Steve muted the stream briefly, his fingers flying over his keyboard as he secured the files on an external drive. If these documents disappeared, if they were wiped, or if someone was watching him, he couldn't risk losing them. His movements were fast, precise, his breath shallow but steady. He unmuted the stream, his voice gaining an edge of determination. "Trap Squad, I need you. Spread the word. Check your local news. Look for any reports of strange drone activity. Anything out of the ordinary. I don't care how small it seems. Something is happening, and we need to figure it out before it's too late." The chat filled with affirmations. Steve let out a slow exhale, the faintest flicker of relief cutting through the tension. But it was short-lived. He stared at the files still open on his screen, the weight of what they represented sinking deeper into his bones. "This is bigger than us," he admitted, more to himself than anyone else. His voice was quieter now, steady, but laced with a gravity that matched the files glowing before him. "But if no one else is going to stop it, we have to try." The stream continued, his audience buzzing with energy, their collective drive a force that had fueled him through countless battles. But Steve couldn't shake the feeling that this time, the stakes were far beyond anything they'd faced before. His hand hovered over the mouse, hesitating for the first time in years. The folder still sat there, its secrets laid bare yet brimming with implications he hadn't even begun to untangle. Somewhere in the mess of files and plans, there was an answer. He just had to find it. The cursor blinked, a silent rhythm that matched the tempo of his thoughts. He closed the folder and leaned back, his gaze drifting to the window where the faint city lights glimmered against the dark. He had exposed scams before, pulled the rug out from under crooks who thought themselves untouchable. But this? This was a different game entirely, and Steve Mallik had just taken his first step onto the board. Part 3. A Conspiracy Unveiled. The files sat like a damning indictment on Steve's screen, their existence heavy with implications he couldn't ignore. Yet, as the days slipped by, his attempts to bring their contents to light hit wall after wall. He stared at his email inbox, its rows of unanswered messages like silent rebukes, screenshots, reports, explanations. He had sent them all to law enforcement, government agencies, even the FBI. The lack of response was deafening. Steve pushed his chair back, its wheels creaking against the worn wooden floor. He paced the narrow confines of his apartment, his thoughts racing in an endless loop of frustration and disbelief. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual indifference, a stark contrast to the storm churning inside him. He glanced back at his desk, the monitor's blue glow casting an accusatory glare. "Am I the only one seeing this?" he muttered, shaking his head. His voice carried a tone of disbelief, tinged with a simmering anger that threatened to boil over. He stopped pacing, leaned forward, and opened the files again, his resolve hardening. If no one else would listen, he'd keep digging until they had no choice. Over the next hours, Steve combed through the documents with the precision of a surgeon. Buried in the technical jargon and schematics, he found encrypted messages that hinted at something far more sinister than he had initially suspected. These weren't just plans for surveillance drones. They were part of a covert operation. The name surfaced again and again. Operation Thundercloud. The further he read, the more the pieces of a disturbing puzzle began to fall into place. The drones, according to the communications, were designed for infiltration. Their intended targets weren't random. They were key points of infrastructure across the U.S. Power grids, communication hubs, and transport lines. The chilling part wasn't just the sophistication of the design but the implication in one particularly damning message: local support essential for deployment success. Steve leaned closer to the screen, his breath shallow as he read it again. Local support. It wasn't just espionage. It was collaboration. Someone on the inside was aiding this operation. His hands trembled as he opened another file, this one detailing correspondences between what appeared to be U.S. officials and the operation's foreign architects. The language was careful, coded, but the intent was clear. Promises of strategic partnership and mutual benefits were thin veils for treachery. It wasn't just an external threat. It was treason. Steve's stomach churned as the enormity of the revelation settled over him. His hand moved to the mouse, almost instinctively, and clicked open his recording software. If no one else would listen, he'd take it to his audience. His voice when he began was steady but carried an edge of urgency. "Trap Squad," he said, his tone sharper than usual, like a wire pulled taut. "I've been looking deeper into the files we found, and I need you all to understand something. This isn't just drones for surveillance. These things are armed, and they're not here for practice runs." The chat feed exploded within seconds, messages scrolling faster than he could read. Theories, questions, expletives. All of it blended into a chaotic stream of text. Steve held up a hand, his expression grave, his voice commanding when he spoke again. "Listen to me. They're planning something big. This operation, Operation Thundercloud, isn't theoretical, it's real, and it's happening soon." He shared his screen, walking his viewers through the evidence. The schematics, the flight paths, the communications. Each file he opened drew gasps from the chat, the gravity of what he was revealing reflected in their frantic responses. But even as he spoke, doubts began to creep into the corners of his mind. Would anyone believe this? Would it matter if they did? Reports started trickling in from his audience, anecdotes of strange drones spotted in unexpected places. One viewer sent a video of a black, unmarked machine hovering near a rural power plant, its movements deliberate and unsettling. Another reported seeing a similar drone circling near an airport. Yet, as quickly as these videos surfaced, they vanished. Social media accounts were suspended, posts flagged and removed. It was as though someone, or something, was watching, erasing evidence as fast as it appeared. Steve's frustration mounted, but he forced himself to remain calm. Panic wouldn't help. He turned to his second monitor, opening a digital map he'd been using to track the reports. Red dots began to cluster around major cities, forming patterns that mirrored the coordinates he'd found in the files. The connections were undeniable. "Do you see this?" he asked, pointing at the screen. His voice carried a mix of anger and determination, cutting through the noise of the chat. "They're not hiding. These drones are testing boundaries, mapping routes, and we're sitting here watching it happen." But not everyone was convinced. A few messages in the chat called him paranoid, a conspiracy theorist. Even some of his longtime followers hesitated, their skepticism bleeding into their responses. Steve couldn't blame them. What he was describing felt too big, too improbable. Yet the files on his screen told a different story, one he couldn't ignore. He tried contacting journalists, hoping that the weight of evidence would compel someone to listen. But every call ended the same way, with polite dismissal or outright disbelief. One editor, a sharp-voiced woman from a national paper, had laughed outright. Drones mapping U.S. cities for some secret operation? Steve, you've been watching too many movies, she'd said, her voice dripping with condescension. He'd hung up without responding, the sting of her words lingering longer than he cared to admit. Steve turned back to his audience, the faces he couldn't see but had come to rely on nonetheless. I know this sounds crazy, he admitted, his voice softer now, tinged with something close to vulnerability. But you've seen the files. You've seen the reports. This is real. And if we don't do something, no one will. He muted the stream, leaning back in his chair. The room felt smaller, the walls closer than they had been an hour ago. He stared at the files still open on his monitor, the evidence he'd uncovered flashing like a warning he couldn't turn away from. Somewhere in this mess, there had to be a way forward, a way to make them listen. Steve's gaze settled on the map, the red dots glowing like embers against the dark backdrop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, hesitant for the first time in years. With a deep breath, he clicked the next file. If the world wouldn't believe him, he'd find the truth himself, no matter how far it took him. Part 4. Signals in the Sky. Steve sat at his desk, the room bathed in the cold, unfeeling glow of his monitors. The clutter around him, empty mugs, crumpled paper, wires tangled in forgotten piles, felt like a physical manifestation of his mind. The digital map on his screen was a sea of red pins, each one a drone sighting reported by his followers. Over the weeks, the dots had grown into clusters, pulsing like an infection spreading across the map. Major cities bore the brunt: Chicago, Atlanta, Los Angeles. Yet even remote areas weren't immune, with scattered pins marking sightings near power grids and isolated airstrips. His head ached, but he couldn't stop. Sleep had become an afterthought, a luxury he couldn't afford when the world itself seemed on the brink of collapse. His emails to the FBI remained unanswered, his videos flagged for misinformation and stripped of monetization. The walls were closing in, but Steve pushed forward, compelled by a mix of desperation and duty. Tonight, the room felt different. It wasn't just the weight of his work, it was the silence. A kind of unnatural quiet that settled deep into his bones, pressing against his chest like a warning. He clicked open another email draft, reworking his message to the FBI for the 4th time that week. Just respond, he muttered, his voice breaking the stillness with a note of pleading he hadn't meant to let slip. The words on the screen blurred together, his exhaustion making the letters swim. And then his screen went black. Steve froze. His fingers hovered above the keyboard, suspended in the moment between panic and action. A soft whirring filled the room, the sound of his computer's fan struggling to catch up. The monitors flickered back to life, but not as they had been. His desktop was empty. No folders, no files. Just a single unmarked icon blinking at the center of the screen. What the hell? He muttered, his pulse quickening. The cursor moved. He hadn't touched the mouse, but it glided across the screen with a precision that wasn't his own. One by one, his files reappeared, then vanished again. His heart hammered as he reached for the power button, slamming his palm against it, but the computer didn't respond. It lasted less than a minute, but by the time the monitors returned to their normal state, his folders were gone. Every piece of evidence he'd collected, erased. Steve shot up, the chair rolling back with a sharp scrape. His breaths came fast, shallow, as he grabbed his phone and began dialing. The ringing felt like an eternity before the call connected. Steve? The voice on the other end was clipped, cautious. Dana, he said, gripping the phone tightly. His tone carried a sharp edge of panic. They just wiped my system. All of it. The files are gone. Dana Keller, The disillusioned NSA analyst who had become an unlikely ally in recent weeks, was silent for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was low, measured, and tense. "They're on to you." Steve paced the small room, his free hand raking through his hair. "What do I do? I backed up some of it, but if they can get into my system, how long before they find that too?" Dana's answer came quickly, her tone sharp with urgency. "Disconnect everything. Now router, modem, anything connected to the internet. They'll trace it if they haven't already." Steve didn't hesitate. He dropped the phone onto the desk, its speaker still active, and dove under the table, yanking cords free with a force that left his hands trembling. The whir of the modem died, leaving the apartment in an oppressive quiet once more. "Okay," he said, picking up the phone again, his breathing uneven. "I'm offline. Now what?" Dana exhaled audibly, her usual composure slipping for just a second. "They're escalating. It means you're onto something they can't risk getting out." Her words sent a shiver through him, but also solidified his resolve. "Dana, I need to know. How far does this go?" For a moment, the line was silent. Steve imagined her on the other end, weighing her words, calculating the risk. When she spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much. "This isn't just some rogue operation," she said. "It's coordinated. Chinese intelligence is running the show, but they're not acting alone. There's help here. High-level help." Steve sank back into his chair, the implications hitting him like a punch to the gut. "You're saying U.S. officials are involved? Collaborating with them?" "Yes," Dana said simply. "Operation Thundercloud isn't just about drones. It's about destabilization. They're targeting infrastructure, communications, key supply lines. And if they succeed—" Her voice trailed off, leaving the rest unspoken. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken consequences. Steve rubbed his temples, his mind racing through possibilities. Why hasn't anyone stopped this? The FBI, the NSA, hell, the military. Someone has to see what's happening. Dana's laugh was bitter, devoid of humor. "Do you think they don't know?" "Of course they know. The question is who they're working for." Steve let out a slow breath, the enormity of the situation settling over him like a weight he couldn't shake. "So what do we do?" Dana's tone shifted, hardening with determination. "We act. But we have to be careful. This isn't just about exposing them. It's about stopping them before it's too late." "What's the timeline?" Steve asked, his voice low but resolute. "Soon," Dana said, her tone grim. "Too soon. If we're going to stop this, we need to move now." Steve nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "Then tell me what you need. Whatever it takes, I'm in." Her response was immediate, her tone sharp with urgency. "I'll send you a secure line. We'll regroup tomorrow. But Steve, stay offline. If they can find you, they'll come for you." He agreed, ending the call and setting the phone down carefully, as though it might detonate. The silence returned, but this time it carried a new weight. Every creak of the floorboards, every distant noise from the street below felt amplified, charged with a threat he couldn't yet see. Steve leaned back in his chair, staring at the blank screen in front of him. The files were gone, but the knowledge they contained burned in his mind. He couldn't unsee what he'd uncovered, couldn't unlearn the truth of what was coming. He sat there for a moment longer, the faint glow of the modem's disconnected lights casting uneven patterns across the desk. Then, with a steadying breath, he reached for the encrypted drive hidden beneath the keyboard tray. They might have erased his files, but they hadn't erased him. Not yet. Part 5. Dawn of Chaos. The day began in fire and metal. Steve jolted awake, the shrill alarm on his phone drowned out by the chaos of emergency news broadcasts. His small apartment felt suffocating, the walls pressing closer as the events unfolded on the screen. Drones, sleek and unmarked, swarmed over Los Angeles, their movements too precise to be anything but calculated. Video footage showed plumes of smoke spiraling into the pale morning sky as explosions erupted across the city. Electrical grids flickered out like dying stars, leaving whole neighborhoods cloaked in darkness. Steve fumbled for the remote, his fingers clumsy from a night of restless sleep. He turned the volume up, the frantic voice of the news anchor filling the room. Multiple reports of unidentified drones engaging in targeted strikes. Authorities are urging residents to stay indoors. His phone buzzed, a cascade of notifications flooding the screen. Messages from his followers poured in, their urgency palpable even through the cold glow of the text. Drones in Chicago, Atlanta under attack. Dallas too. They're everywhere. Steve's stomach turned. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was coordinated. He grabbed his laptop, opening the encrypted map he'd been building with Dana. The red pins marking drone sightings now converged on urban hubs, their clusters growing tighter. His chest tightened as he realized the scale of what was happening. This was it. Operation Thundercloud in motion. The familiar trill of Dana's secure line broke through his haze of thought. He snatched up his phone, her voice cutting through the static. "Steve," she said, her tone clipped and sharp. "You're seeing this?" "Los Angeles is burning," he replied, pacing the room. His voice carried a raw edge of frustration and urgency. "And it's not just LA. They're everywhere. Dana, what do we do?" There was a pause on the line, just long enough for doubt to creep in. When she spoke again, her voice was measured but strained, the words carrying a weight that made Steve's pulse quicken. "I might be able to get us access to a supercomputer grid," she said. "Enough processing power to deploy your worm and take control of the drones." Steve stopped pacing. But, she continued, her tone hardening. "We'd have to hack into classified servers to do it. If we're caught, it's treason. There's no coming back from this, Steve." He ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. The image of drones buzzing like mechanical locusts over American cities burned into his thoughts. The devastation was growing by the minute, and the government's response was sluggish, almost negligent. He knew the risks, but the alternative was unthinkable. "If we don't do this," Steve said, his voice firm, "millions could die. Let's go." The drive to Dana's location felt endless. Steve gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles pale, the familiar roads now tinged with an unfamiliar menace. The faint hum of drones overhead kept him on edge, their presence a constant reminder of the stakes. When he finally arrived, Dana was waiting, her expression set with grim determination. The safe house she had chosen was sparse, its concrete walls and dim lighting giving it the feel of a bunker. A row of monitors lined one wall, each displaying fragmented feeds of the chaos unfolding across the country. Dana gestured for him to sit, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she prepared their next move. "This isn't just about brute force," she explained, her voice steady but laced with urgency. "We need precision. The worm has to infiltrate their network without triggering alarms. Once it's in, we'll have a small window to override the drone's commands." Steve nodded, his jaw tight as he watched her work. "How small?" "Minutes, maybe less." He didn't respond, his focus shifting to the screen. The feed from Los Angeles showed emergency responders struggling to contain fires, their efforts hampered by the relentless swarm of drones. In another window, Chicago was plunged into chaos as drones targeted key bridges and transit systems, cutting off escape routes. Steve's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "We don't have time for cautious," he said, his tone sharp. "We need to move." Dana's gaze flicked to him, her expression unreadable. "This isn't just about speed, Steve. If we rush, we risk everything." He met her eyes, his voice softening but retaining its edge. "And if we wait, more people die." She didn't argue. Instead, she turned back to the monitors, her fingers a blur on the keyboard. "Fine. Let's do this." The supercomputer's interface filled the screen, its sleek, minimalist design belying the immense power it held. Dana navigated the system with practiced ease, her commands precise and deliberate. Steve watched, the tension in the room thick enough to cut. "Launching the worm now," Dana said, her voice steady. The screen shifted, lines of code cascading like a digital waterfall. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the monitors flickered, new feeds replacing the old. The drone's camera views filled the screens, their cold, mechanical gazes sweeping across the cities below. "We're in," Dana said, her voice tinged with both relief and apprehension. But it's not over yet. Steve leaned closer, his eyes scanning the feeds. Can you give me control? Dana nodded, her fingers moving swiftly. It's risky, but yes. Just be careful. Steve's hands hovered over the keyboard, his heart pounding. He selected a drone, its feed expanding to fill the central monitor. The commands were simple, the interface intuitive, but the responsibility weighed heavily. With a deep breath, he issued the first override. The drone's movements changed instantly, its flight path veering away from its target. Steve exhaled, a small victory in a sea of uncertainty. One down, he said, his voice low. How many to go? Thousands, Dana replied, her tone grim. And they'll fight back. The operators on the other end won't just sit by and watch. As if on cue, the monitors flickered again, the feeds glitching as the enemy operators tried to regain control. Dana's expression hardened, her focus unshaken. They're on to us. I'll hold them off as long as I can. Steve nodded, his attention snapping back to the keyboard. The room was a blur of movement and sound. Dana's rapid typing, the faint hum of the supercomputer, the constant beep of alerts. Each drone he redirected felt like a small victory, but the sheer scale of the task was overwhelming. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The tension was suffocating, every second a battle against the clock. Then, the monitors dimmed, replaced by a single message. Override successful. Command network neutralized. Steve slumped back in his chair, the weight of the moment crashing over him. The drones on the feeds powered down, their cameras going dark, one by one. Cities that had been under siege moments ago now stood eerily quiet, the chaos giving way to an uneasy calm. Dana leaned back, her fingers still resting on the keyboard. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but resolute. We did it. Steve nodded, his gaze fixed on the darkened screens. For now. He stood, the reality of what they had accomplished settling in. The battle was over, but the war was far from won. As the first rays of sunlight pierced through the bunker's small window, Steve knew one thing with absolute certainty. This was not good. Part 6. The Digital Battlefield. The bunker's air felt thick, heavy with tension. The monitors lining the wall had gone dark for mere seconds, but those seconds stretched like eternity. Then, as if exhaling one last taunt, the screens came alive again, the drone feeds snapping back to life. The swarms resumed their predatory movements, black machines tearing through the skies like mechanical revenants. Fires burned in the corners of the feed, civilians scattering like ants beneath the cold, calculated assault. No, no, no! Steve's voice cut through the room, sharp and urgent. He stood over Dana's shoulder, his eyes darting between the screens. We shut them down! Dana didn't flinch, her hands a blur on the keyboard. They've rerouted the network, she said, her tone clipped but steady. We only knocked them out temporarily. They had a failsafe ready. Steve's throat tightened, but he forced himself to focus. The battle wasn't over. What's our move? Dana didn't answer immediately. Her brow furrowed, and her fingers danced across the keys, summoning code like a conductor bringing an orchestra to life. I can keep trying to get the worm back in, she said, her voice sharp with determination. But they're reinforcing their firewalls faster than I've ever seen. Then we hit harder, Steve said. His voice carried a hard edge, the kind that spoke of resolve rather than rage. He grabbed his laptop and began inputting commands, his eyes locked on the string of numbers and letters cascading down the screen. They're going to come at us full force, Dana warned. This isn't just about keeping us out. If they find where we're operating from... They won't, Steve interrupted, his tone unyielding. We won't give them the chance. The monitors flickered, the drone's feeds splitting and multiplying. Each screen displayed a new angle of the chaos. Bridges collapsing in Chicago, emergency vehicles stuck in gridlocked Dallas streets, skyscrapers engulfed in smoke in Los Angeles. Every scene was a reminder of what was at stake, every flicker of the screen a taunt from an unseen adversary. Suddenly, one of the monitors flashed red, an alert screaming onto the screen in stark black text. Unauthorized access detected. They're coming at us. Dana's voice rose, her hands moving faster as she scrambled to reinforce their position. They've found the worm. Steve's heart raced, but his movements remained deliberate, calculated. Let them chase it, he said, his voice low and steady. We're going to give them something bigger to worry about. He toggled his live stream, his face appearing on a smaller screen in the corner. Trap Squad, he said, addressing his followers, the urgency in his tone slicing through the noise. This is it. We've got the worm, but we need every ounce of bandwidth you can spare. Download the code, run it, amplify it. If they think they can shut us down, they've got another thing coming. Messages flooded the chat almost instantly, the screen lighting up with pledges of support. Running it now. Got you covered, Steve. Let's take these bastards down. Dana glanced at him, a flicker of admiration breaking through her focused expression. You think they'll be enough? They've never let me down, Steve said, a faint but determined smile pulling at the corner of his lips. The next few minutes were a blur of motion and noise. Alerts blared from every monitor, the cascading streams of code transforming into a battlefield of zeros and ones. Dana and Steve worked in tandem, their movements synchronized as though they had rehearsed this 1,000 times. They're throwing everything at us, Dana muttered, her voice tense but unwavering. We're fighting off a dozen countermeasures at once. Then let's make it 1,001, Steve shot back, his tone laced with dry defiance. He executed another command, directing the worm deeper into the drone's network. I'm pushing through to their command protocols. If we can just sever their main line. They're fortifying it, Dana interrupted. Her fingers didn't stop moving as she spoke, her gaze fixed on the rapidly changing code. They know what we're trying to do. Steve's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before he turned to Dana. What if we overload them? Her head snapped toward him, her eyes narrowing. You're suggesting a brute force attack? Exactly, Steve said. If we hit them hard enough, fast enough, they won't have the bandwidth to stop us. Dana hesitated, her mind racing through the risks. It could work, she admitted. But if it fails? We don't have time to think about failure, Steve said firmly. Let's do it. She nodded, her hands returning to the keyboard. All right. But once we start this, there's no turning back. The bunker seemed to vibrate with tension as the attack began. Steve and Dana unleashed the worm with everything they had, flooding the network with more data than it could handle. The monitors glowed an almost unnatural shade of blue, the screens filled with cascading lines of code that moved too fast to follow. They're scrambling, Dana said, her voice tight but triumphant. We're overwhelming their defenses. Steve didn't respond, his focus entirely on the screen. He watched as one by one, the drone's feeds began to glitch, their movements growing erratic. In one feed, a drone slammed into the side of a building, its camera going dark. In another, a swarm began veering off course, their formation breaking apart like leaves scattered by the wind. They're losing control, Steve said, his tone steady but with an edge of hope. Keep pushing. Dana didn't need to be told twice. Her hands moved with a precision that was almost mechanical, every keystroke calculated, deliberate. We're close, she said. Just a few more minutes. The feed on the central monitor shifted, the drone's movements slowing. One by one they began to descend, their sleek forms landing in vacant lots, empty fields, and abandoned streets. Steve watched, his chest tightening as the realization set in. We did it, he said, his voice soft, almost disbelieving. They're down. Dana leaned back in her chair, her expression one of exhaustion and relief. It's over, she said, her voice barely above a murmur. But Steve didn't move. His eyes remained fixed on the screen, on the empty feeds that once carried images of destruction. No, he said finally, his tone grim. It's not over. Not yet. He turned to Dana, his gaze unwavering. We've stopped the drones, but whoever's behind this, they're still out there, and they won't stop. His voice carried a quiet resolve, the kind that spoke not of triumph, but of the battles yet to come. Part 7. Ashes and Evidence. The silence after the storm was deafening. Across the country, the once menacing drones lay still, their sleek, unmarked frames scattered across fields, roads, and rooftops. Their payloads remained sealed, a chilling reminder of what could have been. Cities smoldered in the aftermath, their streets littered with debris, their skies still carrying the faint scent of fire and destruction. Lives had been lost, neighborhoods devastated, and the fragile trust between the public and its leaders fractured beyond recognition. Steve sat in the back of an old cargo van, its engine humming softly as it carried him and Dana away from the chaos. The interior was dimly lit by the faint glow of his laptop, the screen displaying a scrambled live feed of news reports. Every station replayed the same harrowing footage: drones swarming over major cities, explosions ripping through the dawn, and the collective terror of a nation caught off guard. Heroes or traitors? One anchor speculated, her tone sharp with skepticism. The role of two individuals in halting this unprecedented attack remains unclear, but the government has assured us the situation was contained by official forces. Steve closed the laptop, the weight of the narrative pressing against his chest. He leaned his head back against the van's metal wall, the vibration from the road below a steady thrum against his skull. "They're framing it," he said, his voice low and tinged with bitter resignation. "They'll sweep us under the rug and call it a day." Dana, sitting across from him, adjusted the strap of her bag. Her face was unreadable, but her voice carried a calm resolve. "We knew this would happen. They can't admit the truth. It would tear everything apart." "Everything's already torn apart," Steve shot back, his tone sharp but devoid of malice. He shifted forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "People died, Dana, and they'll just move on? Pretend it was some rogue operator? They'll never admit the rot goes all the way to the top." Dana didn't respond immediately. She reached for a water bottle, her movements deliberate, as though the simple act of drinking could give her a moment to gather her thoughts. "What matters," she said finally, her tone softening, "is that we stopped it. The rest? We'll figure it out." Steve nodded, though the motion felt hollow. The van hit a bump, jostling them both, and he caught a glimpse of the world outside, a blur of trees and empty roads, the remnants of a nation still reeling. Later that night, in the dim safety of a remote hideout, Steve powered up his equipment. The room smelled faintly of dust and mildew, the kind of place that hadn't seen life in years. Dana worked quietly in the corner, sorting through encrypted drives and backup files. The faint tap of her keyboard filled the silence as Steve stared at the camera mounted on his laptop. The screen reflected his image back at him. Unshaven, dark circles under his eyes, the lines of his face etched deeper by the events of the past days. He hesitated, his finger hovering over the record button. What could he say that hadn't already been twisted by the media? What words could make people see the truth? He hit record. "Trap Squad," he began, his voice steady but heavy with the weight of everything they'd endured. "If you're watching this, you already know what happened. You saw the drones, the attacks, the devastation. But what you don't know is the truth behind it all." He leaned forward, his tone sharpening, his words cutting through the stillness of the room like a blade. This wasn't just an accident. It wasn't some rogue operation. This was planned, coordinated, and aided by people in power, people who are supposed to protect us. Dana glanced over, her expression unreadable but her attention unwavering. Steve continued, his voice growing stronger, fueled by a resolve that burned brighter with each word. "We stopped the drones," he said. "But that doesn't mean it's over. The system that allowed this to happen is still in place. The people who betrayed us are still out there. And if we don't hold them accountable, they'll do it again. Maybe not with drones, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll find another way." He paused, the weight of the moment settling over him. His gaze didn't waver from the camera. "I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to look, to question, to demand answers. Because if we let this slide, if we accept their version of events, we're just paving the way for the next disaster." Steve ended the recording, his hand hovering over the save button for a moment before he clicked it. The file joined a growing list of encrypted messages he planned to disseminate through the Trap Squad's networks. If the government wouldn't tell the truth, he'd make sure it found its way out anyway. The days that followed were a blur of movement and strategy. Steve and Dana remained in the shadows, their faces appearing only in fragmented live streams and encrypted forums. The public's response was mixed. Some hailed them as heroes, brave enough to take on the system. Others condemned them as vigilantes, reckless and dangerous. One evening, as they reviewed the latest reports from their network, Dana looked up from her screen. "What's next?" she asked, her voice quiet but purposeful. Steve didn't answer immediately. He stood by the window, staring out at the dense forest surrounding their hideout. The world outside felt distant, almost unreal compared to the digital battlefield they'd been waging war on. "We keep going," he said finally, his tone resolute. "We expose them. All of them. Whatever it takes." Dana nodded, her expression softening. "Then we'd better get to work." Steve turned back to her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. It wasn't a smile of triumph, but of determination, a quiet acknowledgement that their fight was far from over. The camera sat on the desk, its lens pointed at the empty chair where Steve had just been. The recording light blinked once, then went dark, the message sent. Somewhere in the vast expanse of the digital world, his words were already taking root, spreading like embers carried by the wind. For Steve and Dana, the battle ahead was unknown, but the path was clear. They weren't done, not by a long shot. Part 8. Echoes of Betrayal. The air in the hideout was stale, but Steve barely noticed. His focus was locked on the screen in front of him, the web of connections he'd unearthed sprawling across the display like a conspiracy theorist's nightmare. Lines and arrows connected countries, corporations, and individuals, each one tied to a series of financial transactions that painted an unthinkable picture. Dana leaned against the desk, her arms crossed as she watched him work. The faint hum of the laptop filled the room, broken only by the occasional tap of Steve's fingers on the keyboard. "This goes deeper than I thought," Steve said, his voice low, tinged with a simmering frustration. "It's not just China, Iran, Russia, they're all in on it, and we're funding them." Dana arched an eyebrow, her expression a mix of curiosity and disbelief. "How?" Steve turned the screen toward her, highlighting a series of transactions. "Shell companies," he explained, his tone steady but carrying an edge of anger. "Billions funneled out of U.S. government accounts to aid programs in Iran and Russia, but a significant chunk of those funds ends up back in China. It's a loop. Money that's supposed to build alliances is being used to destroy us." Dana's jaw tightened, and she straightened, pacing the room. "And officials know about this? They let it happen?" Steve nodded, his eyes dark with determination. "They're either complicit or too scared to stop it. But either way, it's treason." For a moment, the room fell silent. Outside, the faint rustle of wind against the trees was the only sound, a stark contrast to the storm brewing inside. Steve leaned back, rubbing his temples as he tried to process the enormity of what he'd uncovered. "We can't just sit on this," he said finally, his voice firm. "If we don't expose it, they'll keep going. The next attack won't just be drones. It'll be something worse." Dana stopped pacing, her gaze fixed on him. "What's the plan?" Steve's eyes met hers, a spark of resolve lighting them. "We take it public." The following days were a whirlwind of preparation. Steve and Dana worked tirelessly, combing through every detail of the financial records, tracing the flow of money with surgical precision. They knew they couldn't afford any mistakes. If their evidence wasn't airtight, the powers they were up against would bury them. Steve's YouTube channel became their battlefield. He spent hours scripting his exposé, crafting each word to cut through the noise and resonate with his audience. The setup was simple, just him, his laptop, and the files. But the stakes were anything but. When the day came to release the video, Steve sat in front of the camera, his expression grim but resolute. He adjusted the microphone, took a deep breath, and hit record. "Trap Squad," he began, his voice steady but carrying a weight that demanded attention. "I've been digging deeper into the events of the last few weeks, and what I've found is worse than I could have imagined." He leaned forward, his eyes locking onto the camera as though addressing each viewer directly. "The attack we stopped wasn't just a fluke. It wasn't just one rogue nation acting on its own. This was a coordinated effort, funded in part by our own government. Steve paused, letting the words sink in, the gravity of his tone filling the space. Billions of dollars meant for foreign aid have been funneled into operations designed to destabilize our country. And the people who are supposed to protect us? They knew. They let it happen. The chat exploded almost instantly, comments flooding in faster than he could read. Questions, outrage, disbelief. It was exactly the reaction he'd expected. Steve continued, his voice growing stronger as he clicked through the evidence on screen. These are the transactions. These are the companies. These are the officials who signed off on them. The trail is here, plain as day, and it leads to one conclusion. The people in power aren't just failing us. They're betraying us. The video stretched on, each revelation building on the last. Steve's tone ranged from calm and analytical to fiery and impassioned, his words cutting through the digital ether like a rallying cry. By the time he finished, the chat was a frenzy, his audience galvanized into action. In the days that followed, the fallout was immediate and far-reaching. Steve's video went viral, shared across every corner of the internet. News outlets picked up the story, their headlines splashed with phrases like government betrayal and the hidden war. Protests erupted in major cities, the public demanding answers from their leaders. But the pushback was just as fierce. Officials dismissed Steve's claims as baseless, a desperate attempt for attention. Some outlets labeled him a conspiracy theorist, while others questioned his motives. Yet for every voice that tried to discredit him, there were thousands more standing in his corner. Dana monitored the responses from their hideout, her expression unreadable as she scrolled through the endless stream of reactions. "They're scared," she said, her voice calm but with a hint of satisfaction. "They wouldn't be trying this hard to discredit you if they weren't." Steve didn't look up from his laptop. "Good," he said simply. "Let them be scared." One night, as the protests reached a fever pitch, Steve recorded another message. This time, there was no script, no detailed presentation. Just him, speaking from the heart. "When I started this," he began, his tone quiet but resolute, "I didn't think it would get this far. I just wanted to stop a single attack. But the more I dug, the more I realized this isn't about one event. It's about a system. A system built to serve the few at the expense of the many." He paused, his gaze steady. "I don't know what happens next. Maybe they silence me. Maybe they find me. But whatever happens, this fight isn't over. It can't be. Not when so much is at stake." He ended the recording and sent it out, knowing it might be his last. Somewhere, deep in the labyrinth of servers and networks, Steve's words echoed like a beacon. The battle ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. The truth was out there, and it couldn't be silenced. Not anymore. The fight to protect our nation will continue until every last financial connection to terror has been severed. The end.